There's a particular kind of silence that spiritual seekers know well. It's the silence that comes not from inner peace, but from having successfully muted the parts of themselves that refuse to be transcended. In meditation halls around the world, behind closed eyes and folded hands, souls are quietly suffocating their own cries for help. You've felt it, haven't you? That moment when you realize your spiritual practice has become less about awakening and more about staying asleep to the parts of yourself that hurt too much to hold. The irony cuts deep. In our rush toward enlightenment, we often become experts at spiritual anesthesia. She sits in lotus position, spine straight, breath controlled, while somewhere deep in her solar plexus, a 7-year-old girl is still screaming from a wound that meditation was never meant to heal. He chants mantras in Sanskrit, words that roll off his tongue like ancient prayers, but his nervous system remains locked in patterns that no amount of spiritual bypassing can dissolve. This is the shadow that haunts modern spirituality, the ego dressed as the inner guru, teaching us to rise above our humanity instead of diving deeper into it. We've confused transcendence with dissociation, peace with numbness, and awakening with a sophisticated form of emotional escape. What if true spiritual growth isn't about ascending beyond your pain, but about learning to breathe with it so deeply that it transforms into something sacred? What if the very wounds you're trying to transcend are actually the portals through which your soul is trying to speak? This isn't about abandoning your spiritual practice or dismissing the profound peace that genuine awakening brings. This is about recognizing when our reach for the divine becomes a flight from the human, when our quest for wholeness accidentally fragments us further. There was a woman who collected crystals like some people collect scars, obsessively, desperately, as if the right combination might finally heal what she refused to name. Her altar grew more elaborate with each passing month: rose quartz for self-love, black tourmaline for protection, amethyst for spiritual connection. But late at night, when the candles burned low and the incense faded, she would catch her reflection in the obsidian mirror she'd placed at the center of it all and see not a spiritual seeker, but a refugee from her own emotional truth. The archetype of the seeker carries within it a profound shadow, the part that seeks not to find, but to stay perpetually in motion, always one retreat, one teacher, one practice away from having to stop and feel what's actually there. Jung called this the pure eternus, the eternal child who flies toward the light not from genuine spiritual calling, but from an unconscious terror of touching ground long enough to deal with what's rooted there. In therapy offices across the world, psychologists encounter this phenomenon daily. Clients who speak fluently about chakras and past lives, but go mute when asked about their childhood, who can channel divine energy but can't sit with anger without immediately trying to transform it, who quote Rumi and Hafez but have never written an honest letter to their own pain. Neuroscientist Dan Siegel's research on spiritual bypassing reveals how the prefrontal cortex can actually override the limbic system's emotional processing through certain meditative practices, creating what appears to be peace but is actually a form of neural dissociation. The danger isn't in the practice itself, but in using it to consistently avoid rather than integrate emotional experience. Here's what most don't realize. The wounded ego is remarkably intelligent. It learns the language of awakening and uses it to maintain its defensive structures. It discovers that saying, "I'm releasing this to the universe," sounds more sophisticated than "I'm terrified of feeling this." So it builds elaborate spiritual vocabularies around avoidance. The ego, dressed as the inner guru, whispers seductive half-truths. Anger is low vibration. Fear is just an illusion. You're too evolved to need therapy. It learns to spiritualize emotional bypassing, turning the very tools meant for integration into weapons of self-abandonment. Notice how your body responds when someone suggests you might be using spirituality to avoid something. Does your chest tighten? Do you feel a defensive explanation rising in your throat? Does part of you want to dismiss this entire conversation as negative or not aligned with your vibration? That response, that immediate need to deflect or transcend, might be the very mechanism that's keeping you from the genuine spiritual growth you're seeking. You know you're in spiritual bypassing when your practice makes you feel superior to your own emotions, when your inner peace depends on controlling your external environment, when your spiritual identity becomes more important than your authentic experience. When you find yourself saying, "I don't do drama," instead of, "I struggle with conflict," you've likely confused spiritual maturity with emotional avoidance. If this is resonating with something you've been afraid to acknowledge, I want you to know you're not alone in this recognition. Leave a comment below and share one way you've noticed yourself using spiritual practices to avoid difficult emotions. Sometimes naming it is the first step toward genuine integration. He could speak for hours about energy fields and astral projection, but when his therapist asked him to simply notice the sensation in his stomach during conflict, he went completely blank. For 20 years, he had been reaching upward, toward light, toward consciousness, toward transcendence, while his body remained a stranger, a dense vessel he inhabited but never truly met. In his meditation practice, he would visualize golden light pouring through his crown chakra, flooding his being with divine energy. But his solar plexus, that ancient seat of personal power and emotional digestion, remained clenched like a fist, holding memories his mind had decided were unspiritual to feel. There's a particular kind of spiritual seeker who can discuss the metaphysics of chakras while living completely disconnected from their actual energetic reality. They speak of opening the third eye while their heart chakra remains locked, of raising their vibration while their root chakra screams with unprocessed trauma. This is what somatic therapist Peter Levine calls spiritual dissociation, the unconscious agreement to live from the neck up, treating the body as something to be transcended rather than integrated. The irony is profound. In seeking to become more spiritual, we often become less embodied, and in becoming less embodied, we cut ourselves off from the very vessel through which spirit moves. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's groundbreaking research in The Body Keeps the Score reveals that trauma lives in the nervous system, not just in our thoughts or even our emotions. When we bypass the body in our spiritual practice, we're essentially trying to heal the mind while leaving the wounded nervous system untouched, like trying to tune a guitar while ignoring the strings that are already broken. The polyvagal theory shows us that our autonomic nervous system holds patterns from our earliest experiences. No amount of mental or even emotional processing can fully heal what needs to be addressed at the nervous system level. This is why someone can have profound spiritual insights, yet still find themselves triggered by the same patterns that plagued them before their awakening. She learned to float in meditation, to feel herself dissolving into cosmic consciousness, to experience oneness with all that is. But when her partner raised his voice, her nervous system would flood with the same panic she felt as a child when her father's anger filled the house. Her crown chakra had opened, but her nervous system was still running programs from decades past. This is the crown chakra bypass, reaching for transcendent states while the lower chakras remain unintegrated. It's like trying to build a skyscraper without a foundation, reaching for the heavens while ignoring the earth that must support the entire structure. What most spiritual seekers don't realize is that the body isn't just a vessel for consciousness, it's consciousness itself, speaking in a language older than words. That tightness in your chest when you meditate isn't something to breathe away, it's information. That restlessness that arises in stillness isn't spiritual ADD. It's your nervous system trying to communicate something your mind has been refusing to hear. The body holds not just trauma, but also the keys to its own healing. It knows how to shake off activation, how to discharge stored energy, how to return to regulation. But it can only do this when we stop treating it as an obstacle to transcendence and start honoring it as the sacred vessel through which transcendence actually occurs. Neuroscientist Dr. Dan Siegel's work on embodied awareness shows that true spiritual development requires what he calls mind sight, the ability to see the internal world of self and others. This includes not just thoughts and emotions, but the felt sense of the body, the wisdom of the nervous system, the intelligence of our somatic experience. When we ignore the body in our spiritual practice, we're essentially trying to achieve integration through fragmentation, wholeness through disconnection. It's like trying to hear a symphony while wearing noise-canceling headphones tuned to filter out half the instruments. Right now, as you're reading this, where do you feel it in your body? Not just mentally understanding these words, but actually sensing where this recognition lands physically. Is there a tightness, a softening, a resistance, a resonance? Your body is always speaking. The question is, have you been listening, or have you been so focused on reaching for the stars that you've forgotten you have feet planted on the earth? True spiritual awakening isn't an escape from the body, it's a return to it. It's learning to inhabit yourself so fully that you can feel the divine moving through your very cells, breathing through your lungs, beating through your heart. It's discovering that the temple you've been seeking was always the one you've been carrying around, the one that holds both your wounds and your wings. There was a monk who could sit in meditation for hours without moving, his face serene as still water. Visitors would marvel at his peace, his apparent mastery over the turbulence of human emotion. But what they couldn't see was that 20 years earlier, during his third day in the monastery, something inside him had simply stopped, not transcended, not integrated, just stopped. He had learned to mistake the absence of feeling for the presence of peace. His silence wasn't the deep quiet that comes after emotional storms have been weathered and integrated. It was the eerie calm of a house where all the inhabitants have been locked in the basement. In trauma therapy, there's a phenomenon called functional freeze, when someone appears completely fine on the surface, while their nervous system remains locked in a protective shutdown. They can work, socialize, even seem emotionally available, but underneath, nothing is really moving. Nothing is really alive. Spiritual communities often mistake this state for advanced consciousness. The person who never gets angry, never seems hurt, never appears to struggle, they become the poster child for enlightenment. But what if their serenity isn't the result of having integrated their shadows, but of having successfully anesthetized them? Dick Wardster. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory reveals that the nervous system has three primary states: social engagement, connection, sympathetic activation, fight, flight, and dorsal vagal shutdown, freeze, collapse. When trauma overwhelms our capacity to fight or flee, the nervous system can shift into this shutdown state as a survival mechanism. The dangerous part is that this shutdown can feel profoundly peaceful. The cortisol stops flooding, the hypervigilance quiets, the emotional reactivity ceases. But this isn't the peace of integration, it's the peace of dissociation. It's not wholeness, it's wholeness with half of yourself missing. Research by Dr. Gabor Mate shows that suppressed emotions don't disappear, they go underground, where they continue to influence our biochemistry in ways that can manifest as chronic illness, autoimmune conditions, and what he calls the stress of hidden trauma. When we spiritualize emotional numbness, we're essentially telling our nervous system that its protective mechanisms are enlightenment. We're rewarding dissociation and calling it transcendence. The body, in its infinite wisdom, begins to whisper its protest through symptoms we often dismiss as just stress or spiritual purification. She would say it with such conviction, "I don't hold on to things anymore. I just let everything flow through me." But her chronic fatigue told a different story. Her autoimmune flare-ups spoke of a war being waged in her body while her mind declared peace. Her difficulty forming deep connections revealed that what she called non-attachment might actually be protective detachment. The shadow of spiritual peace is spiritual numbness. The shadow of letting go is having nothing left to hold. The shadow of transcending emotions is having lost access to the very guidance system that emotions provide. A Jungian analyst, Marion Woodman, spoke of the difference between perfection and wholeness. Perfection seeks to eliminate the messy, difficult, imperfect parts of human experience. Wholeness seeks to include and integrate them. Spiritual perfectionism, the unconscious drive to be beyond human emotions, is actually a form of spiritual violence against the soul. Woodman observed that many of her clients had achieved what looked like spiritual maturity, but had actually developed what she called a premature transcendence, reaching for wholeness by rejecting parts of themselves rather than by embracing them. Your nervous system doesn't lie. It can't be spiritually bypassed or philosophically convinced. If you're truly at peace, your body will reflect that integration, not through rigidity or numbness, but through a quality of aliveness that can hold both joy and sorrow, both expansion and contraction. If your spiritual practice leaves you feeling more defended against life rather than more open to it, if your peace depends on controlling your environment or avoiding certain emotions, if your serenity comes with a side of chronic illness or relational difficulties, your nervous system might be trying to tell you something your spiritual identity doesn't want to hear. When you say you're at peace, do you mean you feel genuinely settled and alive in your body? Or do you mean you've successfully managed to not feel much of anything? When you say you've let go, do you mean you've integrated and released? Or do you mean you've gone numb to avoid the pain of holding on? There's a felt difference between the peace that comes after emotional digestion and the peace that comes from emotional anesthesia. One feels alive and spacious. The other feels empty and defended. True spiritual peace isn't the absence of feeling. It's the capacity to feel everything and remain centered in your own being. It's not about becoming invulnerable to life. It's about becoming so grounded in your own wholeness that you can let life move through you without losing yourself in it. The question isn't whether you can transcend your humanity. The question is whether you can embrace it so fully that it becomes transparent to the divine that lives within it. In the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest, there grows a tree known as the Sitka spruce, capable of reaching heights of over 300 feet. But here's what most people don't know. For every foot this giant reaches toward the sky, its roots must descend equally deep into the earth. The tallest trees have the deepest roots, not because they're trying to escape the soil, but because they understand that true height requires true depth. He had been meditating for 15 years, attending retreats, studying with teachers, reaching always upward toward what he called higher consciousness. But when life brought him to his knees, when his marriage dissolved, when his body betrayed him with illness, when depression descended like a fog that no amount of positive thinking could lift, he realized he had been trying to build a skyscraper on quicksand. Modern spirituality has become obsessed with raising vibration, ascending to higher dimensions, transcending lower emotions. There's an implicit hierarchy that places love above anger, joy above sadness, peace above conflict. But what if this vertical model of spiritual growth is actually keeping us spiritually stunted? Indigenous traditions know something we've forgotten, that power comes not from rising above the earth, but from sinking so deeply into it that you become a bridge between worlds. That wisdom isn't found by escaping the dark, but by learning to see in it. Jung called it the descensus ad inferos, the descent into the underworld. He understood that psychological and spiritual development isn't a linear ascent toward light, but a spiral journey that repeatedly takes us down into the depths of our own psyche, where we encounter what he called the shadow, not to overcome it, but to integrate it. In his own life, Jung experienced what he called his nox profunda, his deepest night, a period of psychological crisis that lasted several years. But instead of trying to rise above it or transcend it, He descended into it, dialogued with it, painted it, wrote it, dreamed it. This descent became the foundation for his most profound contributions to understanding the human psyche. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris's research on psychedelics reveals that breakthrough spiritual experiences often involve what he calls cognitive disintegration, a temporary dissolving of the default mode network that maintains our sense of separate self. But here's the crucial part. This dissolution isn't about escaping the ego. It's about loosening it enough to reorganize at a higher level of complexity. The brain doesn't transcend its lower functions during these experiences. It integrates them more fully. The reptilian brain, the limbic system, and the neocortex begin communicating in new ways. It's not ascension, it's integration. She could speak eloquently about 5D consciousness and crystalline DNA upgrades, but when her teenage daughter slammed the door in anger, she would immediately try to shift the energy rather than simply sitting with the pain of feeling rejected. Her reach for high vibration had become a sophisticated form of emotional avoidance. This is the modern spiritual trap, believing that evolved consciousness means feeling only positive emotions, that enlightenment means never being triggered, that spiritual maturity means transcending the messy reality of being human. In Women Who Run with Wolves, Estes reminds us that the soul doesn't want to be sanitized or spiritualized. It wants to be wild, authentic, fully alive to the entire spectrum of human experience. The wild woman archetype isn't about being positive or light. It's about being real, being raw, being connected to the primal wisdom that lives in the bones. Estes teaches that many women have lost connection to their instinctual nature because they've been taught that spiritual women are always gentle, always positive, always high vibe. But the wild feminine knows that sometimes love looks like fierce protection, sometimes wisdom looks like holy anger, sometimes healing looks like breaking apart before coming back together. What if true spiritual ascension is actually subterranean? What if the path to genuine enlightenment leads not up and away from human experience, but down and deeper into it? What if the very emotions and experiences we're trying to transcend are actually the raw material from which authentic spirituality is forged? Consider this: the mystics throughout history, from John of the Cross to Rumi to Hafez, all wrote their most profound spiritual poetry from places of deep human experience. Their darkness, their longing, their heartbreak weren't obstacles to their spiritual realization. They were the very soil from which their wisdom grew. Beneath the forest floor exists an intricate network of fungal threads connecting tree roots, sharing nutrients, and communicating information across vast distances. This wood wide web is invisible to surface observation, yet it's the foundation that allows the entire forest ecosystem to thrive. In the same way, our deepest spiritual growth often happens in the invisible underground of our psyche, in our dreams, our symptoms, our slips of tongue, our emotional reactions. The part of us that tries to rise above these experiences is missing the very network through which genuine transformation occurs. Instead of asking, how can I transcend this? Try asking, how can I go deeper into this? Instead of, how can I rise above this emotion? Try, what is this emotion here to teach me? Instead of, how can I get past this pattern? Try, what would it mean to move through this pattern with full presence? Notice what happens in your body when you consider the possibility that your depression might be a spiritual initiation, that your anxiety might be your soul's way of getting your attention, that your anger might be carrying important information about your boundaries. Does part of you resist this? Does part of you feel relief? The path of descent isn't about wallowing in negativity or staying stuck in painful patterns. It's about developing the spiritual maturity to meet whatever arises with presence, to trust that the soul's curriculum includes both ecstasy and agony, to understand that wholeness isn't about feeling good all the time. It's about feeling everything with an open heart. She called it divine guidance when something inside her whispered not to take the job, not to go to the party, not to have the difficult conversation with her sister. For years, she had cultivated what she believed was a refined sensitivity to energy, an ability to feel when something was aligned or not meant to be. But in therapy, a different pattern emerged. Every time her intuition said no, it was to something that would have required her to be seen, to be vulnerable, to risk rejection or failure. Her spiritual guidance had become eerily similar to the voice that had protected her as a child by keeping her small, safe, and hidden. There's a particular sophistication to the way wounded parts of our psyche learn to speak the language of spirituality. The inner critic discovers that "this doesn't feel aligned" sounds more evolved than "I'm terrified of judgment." The perfectionist learns that "I'm being called to wait for the right timing" feels more spiritual than "I'm paralyzed by fear of making the wrong choice." This isn't to dismiss genuine intuition, that deep knowing that arises from a place of centered wisdom, but it's to recognize that the unconscious is remarkably clever at hijacking our spiritual vocabulary to maintain familiar patterns of self-protection. Neuroscientist Dr. Antonio Damasio's research on somatic markers reveals that what we call intuition often arises from the body's rapid processing of environmental cues below the threshold of conscious awareness. The vagus nerve, connecting brain to body, constantly sends information about safety and threat based on micro-expressions, vocal tones, and energy dynamics. But here's the crucial distinction. True intuitive knowing feels different in the nervous system than fear-based reactivity. Genuine intuition tends to arise from a state of relative calm and feels spacious, even when it's saying no. Fear-based guidance feels contracted, urgent, and often comes with elaborate justifications. Dr. Gabor Mate teaches about the difference between gut instinct and gut reaction. A gut instinct arises from integrated wisdom. It's calm, clear, and doesn't need to convince you of its truth. A gut reaction arises from unprocessed trauma. It's urgent, defensive, and often accompanied by a compelling story about why you must listen to it. The wounded self learns to mimic the voice of wisdom so effectively that many sincere spiritual seekers spend years following what they believe is divine guidance, only to discover they've been unconsciously avoiding growth, intimacy, and authentic self-expression. He had mastered the art of spiritual excuse-making. When his business partner confronted him about missing deadlines, he would say, "I don't think we're energetically aligned anymore." When his girlfriend asked for more emotional intimacy, he would respond, "I need to focus on my spiritual practice right now." When his therapist suggested he might be avoiding difficult feelings, he would smile serenely and say, "I'm just following my inner guidance." Each response felt spiritually sophisticated, but underneath was a terrified child who had learned that conflict meant abandonment, that being seen meant being rejected, that vulnerability meant danger. Rumi wrote, "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray." Notice he didn't say, "by what feels safe," or "by what confirms your existing beliefs," or "by what requires no risk." He said, "by what you really love." And love, true love, always asks us to grow beyond our current limitations. The spiritual seeker trapped in fear-based guidance will find themselves consistently drawn to teachers, practices, and communities that confirm their existing worldview and never challenge them to expand beyond their comfort zone. They'll interpret this as resonance when it might actually be stagnation. True spiritual discernment has a quality of groundedness, even when it's directing you towards something challenging. It doesn't come with anxiety about making the wrong choice because it trusts the process of learning through experience. It doesn't need to justify itself with elaborate spiritual explanations because it arises from a deep knowing that doesn't require external validation. Fear-based spiritual guidance, on the other hand, feels urgent and brittle. It's often accompanied by rigid rules about what's spiritual and what isn't. It tends to divide the world into high vibe and low vibe experiences, creating a spiritual hierarchy that conveniently places anything challenging or uncomfortable in the not aligned category. Campbell understood that the spiritual path isn't about avoiding the call to adventure. It's about answering it despite our fears. Every genuine spiritual tradition includes stories of seekers who had to leave the familiar, face the unknown, and encounter their deepest fears in order to find their authentic power. When our intuition consistently steers us away from challenge, growth, and the unknown, we might want to question whether we're following the hero's journey or the victim's retreat. Here's a simple way to distinguish between fear-based guidance and authentic wisdom. Breathe deeply and ask your body to show you the difference. When you think about a choice from fear, notice the quality of contraction, the urgency, the need to convince yourself. When you rest in genuine knowing, notice the spaciousness, the calm clarity, the absence of internal argument. True spiritual guidance doesn't need to be defended or explained. It simply is. It trusts that you're capable of handling whatever unfolds from following it, even if that includes difficulty, challenge, or temporary discomfort. What if your soul's guidance is actually calling you toward the very experiences your wounded self wants to avoid? What if authentic spiritual development requires not just the courage to trust your inner knowing, but the wisdom to distinguish between the voice of your soul and the voice of your survival strategies? Think of a recent decision where you followed what you called spiritual guidance. Was it guidance that invited expansion or contraction? Did it ask you to risk growth or maintain safety? Did it require courage or simply confirm what you already believed? The soul's curriculum often includes experiences that challenge our comfort zones, invite us into deeper authenticity, and ask us to show up more fully to life. If your spiritual guidance consistently points away from these invitations, it might be time to examine who's really doing the guiding. There was a woman who had forgotten how to cry, not because she had transcended sorrow, but because somewhere along her spiritual journey, she had learned that enlightened beings don't weep. She could speak beautifully about surrendering to divine will, about trusting the perfection of all experiences. But when grief arose, for her mother's death, for her marriage's end, for dreams that had quietly died, she would immediately shift into spiritual interpretation mode. "Everything happens for a reason," she would say, her voice steady and wise. "This is just the universe calling me to a higher level of consciousness." But late at night, alone in her meditation room, her body would shake with a trembling she couldn't name, a wordless knowing that something essential was being sacrificed on the altar of her spiritual identity. One evening, during a particularly profound meditation, instead of reaching for transcendence, she found herself sinking into the ache in her chest. For the first time in years, she let herself feel the weight of her losses without trying to transform them into lessons. And in that moment of pure, uncomposed grief, she touched something more sacred than any enlightened state she had ever cultivated. What if spirituality isn't about learning to feel less, but about learning to feel more skillfully? What if the path to genuine awakening leads not away from our emotions, but deeper into their wisdom? What if the very feelings we've been trying to transcend are actually the doorways through which the divine is trying to reach us? Modern spiritual culture has created a subtle but pervasive hierarchy that places higher emotions like love and joy above lower emotions like anger and sadness. But indigenous wisdom traditions know something we've forgotten: that all emotions are sacred messengers, carrying information essential for our spiritual development and psychological well-being. Dr. Dan Siegel's research on emotional regulation reveals that healthy psychological development isn't about controlling or transcending emotions, but about developing what he calls emotional integration, the ability to feel fully while maintaining access to our prefrontal cortex's capacity for reflection and choice. When we consistently bypass difficult emotions through spiritual practices, we actually impair our nervous system's natural capacity for regulation. The emotions don't disappear. They go underground, where they continue to influence our behavior in unconscious ways while remaining inaccessible to our conscious awareness and choice. Somatic therapist Peter Levine teaches that the body is constantly processing and integrating experience through what he calls felt sense, the subtle internal awareness of sensation, movement, and energy that most people have learned to ignore or override. Your body knows things your mind hasn't yet discovered. It knows when someone is safe before your thoughts have analyzed their behavior. It knows when a situation is nourishing or depleting before your rational mind has weighed the pros and cons. It knows when you're avoiding something important before your ego has constructed elaborate justifications for that avoidance. She had been taught that anger was unspiritual, that evolved beings don't get triggered, that enlightened response means always choosing love over conflict. But when her teenage daughter began experimenting with dangerous behaviors, something fierce and protective arose in her. Something that had nothing to do with enlightenment and everything to do with love. In that moment, she realized that her anger wasn't the opposite of love. It was love in action, love that refused to stand by while something precious was threatened. Her spiritual practice hadn't prepared her for this kind of holy fury, this sacred no that arose from the deepest place of caring. In Women Who Run with Wolves, Estes writes about what she calls proper anger, the kind of anger that arises when something sacred is being violated, when boundaries are being crossed, when truth is being distorted. This isn't the destructive anger that comes from wounded ego, but the protective anger that comes from healthy instinct. Many spiritual seekers have lost access to this vital force because they've been taught that anger is always destructive, always unspiritual. But Estes reminds us that without access to healthy anger, we become vulnerable to exploitation, unable to protect what we love, incapable of setting boundaries that preserve our integrity. He had lost his father 6 months earlier, but instead of allowing himself to grieve, he had immediately begun working with the spiritual meaning of the loss. "Dad's in a better place now," he would say. "This is just helping me detach from material attachments." But his dreams were full of searching, endless landscapes where he wandered, calling for someone who never answered. In traditional cultures, grief was understood as a sacred portal, a time when the veil between worlds grows thin and the soul undergoes a necessary reorganization. Grief wasn't something to be fixed or transcended, but something to be entered into with reverence, witnessed by community, honored as a holy passage. True spiritual practice isn't about achieving particular states of consciousness. It's about developing the capacity to be present with whatever arises. This includes the capacity to be present with discomfort, with uncertainty, with emotions that don't fit our spiritual self-image. When anxiety arises, instead of immediately trying to breathe it away or transcend it, what would it mean to get curious about it, to ask what it's trying to protect, what it's concerned about, what wisdom it might be carrying? When sadness emerges, instead of immediately reaching for spiritual explanations or positive reframes, what would it mean to simply let it be felt, to offer it the same presence you would offer a grieving friend? Here's a simple but profound practice. Tonight, before you sleep, sit quietly and ask your body what it needs to tell you. Not your mind, not your spiritual ideals, but your actual felt experience. Place your hands on your heart and listen. Maybe there's anger that's been waiting to be acknowledged. Maybe there's grief that's been postponed in service of staying positive. Maybe there's fear that's been dismissed as unspiritual, but carries important information about your boundaries or your safety. Listen without trying to fix, transform, or transcend what you find. Simply witness, simply receive, simply let your emotional world be as complex and messy and sacred as it actually is. What if your spiritual practice became less about achieving particular states and more about developing the capacity to be authentic with whatever states naturally arise? What if enlightenment isn't about feeling peaceful all the time, but about feeling whatever is true with an open heart? As you read these words, what's present in your emotional landscape right now? Is there something you've been trying to transcend that might actually be trying to guide you? Is there a feeling you've labeled as unspiritual that might be carrying sacred information? The path of embodied spirituality doesn't ask you to feel differently. It asks you to feel consciously, to bring presence to whatever is true, to trust that your emotional world is not an obstacle to your spiritual development, but the very ground in which it grows. In a culture obsessed with rising above, with transcending, with ascending to higher dimensions, perhaps the most radical spiritual act is learning to descend into your body, into your feelings, into the rich, complicated, utterly human experience of being a soul in form. This isn't spiritual regression, it's spiritual embodiment. It's discovering that the divine doesn't live somewhere above your human experience. It lives within it, breathes through it, speaks through it, loves through it. There's an ancient story of two birds perched on the same tree. One bird, restless and hungry, flits from branch to branch, constantly seeking the perfect fruit, the sweetest nectar, the highest perch. The other bird sits in stillness, simply witnessing, perfectly content to be exactly where it is. For years, spiritual teachers have used this metaphor to illustrate the difference between the ego mind and the awakened consciousness. But what they often miss is the deeper truth. Both birds live in the same tree. The awakened bird doesn't transcend the tree, doesn't fly away to a purely spiritual realm. It learns to inhabit the tree so fully, so presently, that it discovers the sacred within the ordinary, the eternal within the temporal, the divine within the utterly, messily, beautifully human. She had spent 15 years trying to escape her humanity through spirituality. Meditation retreats that taught her to observe her thoughts from a detached distance, breathwork sessions that promised to elevate her vibration beyond earthly concerns, plant medicine ceremonies that temporarily dissolved her sense of being a separate self in a physical body. But the breakthrough came not in a moment of transcendence, but in a moment of complete descent. Sitting with her dying mother, feeling the weight of love and loss so intense, it threatened to shatter every spiritual defense she had ever constructed. In that hospital room, holding her mother's hand as breath became more precious than enlightenment, she realized that true awakening wasn't about escaping the human condition. It was about inhabiting it so fully that it became transparent to the divine. Carl Jung understood that psychological wholeness requires what he called the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, spirit and matter, transcendence and immanence. The spiritual seeker who tries to eliminate one half of this equation will always remain fragmented, no matter how enlightened they appear. True spiritual evolution isn't about choosing the light over the dark, the spiritual over the material, the transcendent over the immanent. It's about discovering that these apparent opposites are actually complementary aspects of a larger wholeness that can only be accessed through integration, not elimination. Dr. Daniel Siegel's research on neural integration reveals that optimal mental health occurs when different regions of the brain can communicate fluidly with each other. When we consistently favor one mode of processing over another, whether that's rational over emotional, transcendent over embodied, or spiritual over psychological, we actually impair our nervous system's capacity for integration. The most resilient and creative individuals are those who can access the full spectrum of human consciousness: analytical thinking and intuitive knowing, emotional depth and spiritual transcendence, individual awareness and collective consciousness. They don't achieve this by suppressing any aspect of their humanity, but by learning to hold all aspects with equal reverence. Here's what the mystics throughout history have always known but rarely stated directly. The goal of spiritual practice isn't to become less human, it's to become more human than you ever imagined possible. It's to discover that your humanity, fully embraced and integrated, is itself the doorway to the divine. The most spiritually mature individuals aren't those who have transcended emotions, but those who can feel deeply without losing their center. They're not those who have eliminated their shadows, but those who have integrated them consciously. They're not those who live in some rarefied spiritual realm, but those who have learned to find the sacred in washing dishes, changing diapers, paying bills, and having difficult conversations. Rumi, perhaps the most beloved spiritual poet in history, didn't write about transcending human experience. He wrote about diving so deeply into it that it revealed its divine nature. His poetry is full of longing, heartbreak, passion, and the very human experience of seeking and losing and finding again. "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love," he wrote. "It will not lead you astray." Notice he didn't say it would lead you away from the world, but deeper into authentic engagement with it. What if the enlightenment you've been seeking isn't waiting for you in some future moment of transcendence, but is available right now, in this breath, in this heartbeat, in this very ordinary and utterly extraordinary moment of being alive in a human body? What if the divine isn't somewhere else, waiting for you to become pure enough or evolved enough to access it, but is here, breathing through your lungs, beating through your heart, feeling through your emotions, thinking through your thoughts? True spiritual awakening doesn't remove you from life. It makes you more alive to it. It doesn't eliminate your humanity. It reveals the divinity that was always flowing through it. It doesn't transcend your emotions. It discovers the wisdom they carry. It doesn't escape your body. It comes home to it. This is the ultimate paradox of authentic spirituality. The more fully you inhabit your humanity, the more transparent it becomes to something vast and sacred and eternal that is both entirely beyond you and completely inseparable from you. So stop trying to transcend yourself. Start inhabiting yourself. Stop trying to rise above your life. Start diving deeper into it. Stop treating your humanity as an obstacle to overcome and start recognizing it as the very vehicle through which awakening occurs. Your emotions are not distractions from your spiritual practice. They are your spiritual practice. Your body is not a prison from which your soul needs to escape. It is the temple in which your soul has chosen to live. Your relationships, your challenges, your very human struggles are not detours from your spiritual path. They are your spiritual path. The soul you've been seeking was never lost. It was only waiting for you to stop running from yourself long enough to remember that you were never separate from what you seek. The divine you've been reaching for lives in the very breath that carries these words, in the very heart that responds to their truth, in the very human experience that you've been so eager to transcend. Awakening is not a flight from your humanity. It's learning to dive so deeply into it that you discover the wings you've always had, not to escape the world, but to soar within it, not to transcend your life, but to finally, fully, courageously live it. If these words have stirred something in you that's been waiting to be acknowledged, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Share one way you've noticed yourself using spirituality to avoid rather than embrace your full human experience. Sometimes naming these patterns is the first step toward genuine integration. And if this exploration has been valuable for you, consider subscribing to continue this journey of embodied awakening together. There's so much more to discover about the intersection of psychology and spirituality, about the sacred art of being fully human. I'll leave you with this question to carry into your day. Where in your life are you still mistaking transcendence for anesthesia? And what would it mean to bring your whole self, shadow and light, human and divine, to that place? Thank you for diving deep with me today. I'll see you in the next exploration of the soul's hidden territories.